Welcome to this edition of the Your Weekly Dose of Nonprofit podcast, the podcast that delivers actionable items you can implement at your organization right away. I'm your host, Ephraim Gopin of 1832 Communications. Today, I'm really happy to have with us a nonprofit and fundraising specialist, Janice Cunning. Janice, how you doing today?
I'm great. It's so nice to be here with you on the podcast.
Thank you for being here. Let me introduce you to our listeners, watchers, and readers. Janice Cunning is an experienced fundraising consultant and certified coach who specializes in nonprofit leadership development. As a coach, Janice is passionate about partnering with fundraisers to help them create an inspired vision that transforms lives. In addition to her coaching work, Janice loves working with teams and facilities online and on-site workshops. Janice combines her coaching skills with 17 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She was previously a senior consultant at KCI, Canada's largest fundraising consulting firm. Janice lives in downtown Toronto. She loves to read, and most winter weekends, you will find her skating by the lake. In today's episode, we're going to discuss everybody wants to rule the world, but can they? Let's dive right in. Janice, what's the difference between a manager and a leader, and how does that difference affect the overall office environment?
Well, I love that question, and I'm going to add one more category that we tend to think about. So we tend to, in a lot of our training courses, talk about like being a manager, being a leader, and then being a coach. And so I think, it's sort of the classic idea, like as a leader, it's really much more about the vision. Like you're asking like what's needed, what's the right thing to do, and setting a vision, not only for yourself and your team, but actually the organization as a whole. And then I think managers are the ones who actually make sure things get done, right? So they're sort of like setting the plans and monitoring progress. And then we like to bring in this idea of also wearing your coach hat. So that could be like you're championing the team, like you're the person who really makes people believe they can do more than they think they can, which I have had some amazing bosses who've done that for me in the past. It's the person who asks great questions, who acknowledges your strengths, who gives you feedback. And so I think what's important and the way we like to think about it is it's very fluid. It's not like necessarily that you have to think about yourself like I am a manager and so I don't have to worry about vision. We think of it more like hats, right? Like you have to put on these different hats, and it's the more I think we can wear the coach hat, the more success organizations can have. But at the same time, there are times when you really need to manage because something needs to get done.
Yes, absolutely. So, fundraisers often find themselves in a silo. They're the only ones taking care of and doing the asking. It's all on their shoulders. How can they encourage the rest of the staff to become involved?
Yeah, I was talking to my business partner, Margaret Katz-Can, who's the person on our team who kind of like works the most with sort of small and mid-size charities, and herself was an executive director in the past. And she was talking about, it's sort of this, she used the analogy like maybe you hire a janitor and you think like that's the person who cleans. So like nobody else has to clean, right? Which is ridiculous. Like we all have to clean our coffee cups, right? So in some ways, I think that's kind of a fun analogy, like this idea like, oh, phew, like we hired a fundraiser. That's 100% of their job. The rest of us are off the hook. And that can be like colleagues and staff, but also the board, right? So she was talking about, like the way that she likes to frame it is really helping people to become an ambassador. Like at a very minimum, they should be able to talk passionately and well about the organization and its mission. And so she had this great story that happened during her career where their front desk receptionist was just sort of making small talk with this very sweet older man who was waiting for his daughter who was like visiting another organization within their building. And she started talking about what they do, and he was really interested, and they ended up getting a $10,000 unrestricted gift from that person, just because that staff member actually was able to talk with that passion. And so I think that's a great story. And so I often think that stories are the way to build that. Like, tell those stories at your staff meetings. Make sure that you have retreats where literally every person is invited and you're talking about your organization's story. And every time something successful like that happens, just build on it. And then I think people will start to see that fundraising isn't the scary thing, that it's really just relationships and talking to people, which most people like.
Yes, absolutely. So, speaking of all staff and today's actionable item, because of the hierarchy issue, it can be difficult for staff to give feedback to senior managers. Please tell us 3 ways C-level executives can encourage lower level staff to provide honest and timely feedback, i.e. create a culture of accountability.
Yeah. So number one, if you haven't read Radical Candor by Kim Scott, get that book and read it. It's the book I probably most recommend pretty much every coaching client that I work with. I tell them to read that book. And that book is really about many things, but a big piece of it is this idea of creating a culture of radical candor is like we are being very honest, but we're doing it from a place where we really care about people. It's a very human way of thinking about feedback. So I think that book is a great primer. I think the second thing is when you want to create a culture of feedback and accountability, you actually have to start by asking for feedback. Like sometimes I think leaders make a mistake where they start going around and giving feedback, and it can be intimidating for people. And one thing I often say to my leaders that I'm coaching is like ask something very specific, like what is one thing that I could do differently that would make your job easier? Because if you just say, do you have any feedback for me? Like you've probably been asked that, right? And you're like, no, everything's great. So I think that some kind of question where it's like, I need you to give me one thing that I can do differently. And then I think the third thing I would say is whatever you get, because often it's very tentative and small at the beginning, be excited about it, really appreciate the person for giving that, think about it, and then as much as you can, try to actually make a concrete change and make sure the person sees that loop. Like, okay, they actually were open to listening to me, they took it seriously, and something changed. And I think it will be baby steps. And then you'll get to the point where people will be willing to say things that are a little bit more candid.
Excellent. I like all 3 of those, but that third one really speaks to me in terms of letting people feel good that change happened because they actually spoke up.
Yeah, the worst thing is if you get feedback and you trying to justify yourself, you'll never get feedback again.
Yes, absolutely. You've been coaching and training nonprofit teams for many years. What's the most common toxic workplace characteristic that you see, and how can it be fixed?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's maybe not the most toxic, but I think it's so common that I want to talk about it, is I think that there's the squeeze between once you become a leader as a fundraiser, between still having to raise a lot of money and having your own donors and being a leader. I think what happens, I see a lot, is many organizations do not prioritize good leadership. All of the kind of like measurements and how you're doing and being rewarded are really more about your board, volunteer, and donor relationship. So I see a lot of people, a lot of people come to me for coaching, and sometimes they're being sponsored. That's the ultimate by their organization, but sometimes they're personally paying, which is a big investment they're making. And they do that because they see that this is such a problem. Like, if you're not a good leader, you're not going to be getting the most out of your team. And it can be seductive when you're good at fundraising and enjoy it to kind of spend your time there. But you actually have to pull back and say, like, I need to learn how to, like we talked about at the beginning, like set a vision. I need to understand my values. Like, what do I actually value as a leader? How do I want to show up? I need to help other people set goals and achieve them. And I need to build this culture of trust. Like, I think so much of leadership really is about building a culture. Like you said earlier, it's like nobody's going to give you feedback if there's not trust. People are not going to be accountable if there's not trust. And they're not going to get through hard times, if there isn't trust. So I think it's not so much like maybe the most toxic, but like I said, the most common thing is like, how do I actually devote time to being a great leader, which takes time, especially when you haven't done it before.
Absolutely. So on your company website, fundraisingleadership.org, you talk about building team trust. We both know about the immense pressures of working at a nonprofit and how difficult cohesiveness can be to achieve. How do you define, or what is a commitment to vulnerability, and how does that connect to team trust?
Yeah. So I'm going to circle back to what I started with, which is that idea of wearing that coach hat. So I think that wearing a coach hat is like a natural way to kind of create that vulnerability for yourself, because instead of being the expert, which again, that's a hard transition, right? Because that's often why you got promoted, because you have this expertise. It's putting on that coach hat and saying, like, I'm going to ask more questions. I'm going to admit when I don't have an answer, or I'm going to say, like, I have an idea, but I want to hear more ideas. And so I think that's a big piece of it. I also think the other piece of like being committed to vulnerability is being like hyper aware of your own emotions as a leader, being willing to like name things and encouraging your team to name things, like just as simple as like, I'm feeling some sense of frustration because we're not moving forward here. Because I think for many years, and this is hopefully and thankfully changing, people felt like, oh, if I was frustrated, I'll just pretend I'm not frustrated. Well, human beings feel other people's emotions. Like there's so much research about that. So I think that's, it's both of those things. It's kind of letting go of the expert hat, asking more questions, and it's also being willing to kind of talk about how you're feeling. And I think last year was, in 2020, it was sort of like a lot of people got an opportunity to see people's like children. And I was telling you right before, my husband had to take my dog out because we just rescued a dog and she's unpredictable, right? So we're all getting like a little bit more comfortable, admitting to people like the circumstances we're in, which is a good thing.
Very good thing. Excellent.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the lightning round and learn more about you. What got you started on your nonprofit career path?
So I have a master's degree in library science, and when I graduated, there were no jobs in the library world, really. And so I heard this. Somebody actually said to me, like, "Oh, there's this person at the University of Toronto hiring a whole bunch of library graduates to do." I started in prospect research, and then I went into consulting, which I loved. I did that for almost 10 years, and I think that to me kind of made that transition to coaching, because consulting is all about building relationships and rapport with people, and you know and and that kind of fed my soul. Like I'm a much more uh sort of like, as a prospect researcher, I enjoyed the work, but I love like relationships with people, so consulting suited me much better.
Quick follow-up. How do you define library science? Your degree.
Well, yeah, it's funny because I was actually the last year of the library science program, which is a master's degree that you need to actually technically be a librarian. And yeah, and now it's a master of information. So it's much more technology based. But I learned like cataloging and rare books and, all sorts of
All the
things
things
that
I
I've never
grew up
used.
with using at libraries, yes. If there's one thing you could shake up in the nonprofit world, what would it be?
So it's similar to what I said earlier. Like if I had a magic wand, I would put as much or perhaps more emphasis on leadership as dollars raised. Like I think the how you raise money is even more important than how much. So that's what I would change.
I like that line. That's excellent. Favorite thing about living in Toronto?
Toronto is a city of neighborhoods. And that's not just like a marketing thing, it really is. So I love that. I love walking. I walk everywhere and I love that everything is in my neighborhood. But I love that it's a big city. Like we have lots of culture, great restaurants, and diversity, and all sorts of things that big cities have. But you can still randomly run into people you know. So it's kind of it's very like Chicago to me. That's my favorite city in America. And Toronto to me is very similar.
Cool. You love to read and talk about books. What's a favorite book from your childhood?
So my mom read Little House on the Prairie, the whole series to me, like so many times that when I read it as an adult, like I really remember, especially the earlier books. And I am like very minimalist, but pretty much the only thing I have from my childhood is actually the box set of the paperbacks, Little House on the Prairie.
Oh,
And my mom, I think I mean, I love reading and that comes from her, but I also think that it's more that she always gave herself time to do that thing that she loved. And that gave me permission to kind of grow up thinking it's okay to take time for things you love.
excellent. I think I might know the answer to this question. If you weren't working in the nonprofit sector, what would be your profession?
Well, I mean, I think that if things had been different, I would have been an academic librarian. but I feel quite grateful. I mean, the older I get, like I was always a planner, like especially when I was younger, like I had my whole life mapped out. And then many things happened personally and professionally that derailed me. And I realized, the power of those circumstances where different things happen. But I gotta say that I loved being a breastwork researcher. I loved being a consultant, and now I love being a coach. And so I'm glad that nowadays we don't have to choose one path and stick.
It's good to find the things you love doing and then to be able to do them. That's
Yes.
great. Last question. Let's turn the tables. You get to ask me a surprise question. I have no idea what's coming. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a question that we often use as an icebreaker in our workshops because it's a fun question, but it does start to build trust and rapport with people. And so the question is, tell me one activity that you loved to do when you were a child.
Oh, man. Okay, so going back like a gazillion years when I was a child, I grew up in a very small town in Connecticut, and we had a large backyard and we had a large front yard. And it was in the 70s when your parents weren't wondering where you're going. They just said you have to be home for dinner by 5. And that was the only, and myself and certainly my younger siblings, because I'm the oldest of 6, we figured out things to do, activities to do on our own. We didn't come to my parents and say, what can we do now? We're bored. There was none of that. So
Yeah.
activities, what I did as a kid, I mean, I loved sports. And so I loved playing all sports. Bike riding was a big one.
Mm.
I mean, we rode without helmets. I know that's not safe, but it was the 70s, people.
I know.
That's what it was. My parents surprised me for my 6th birthday with the red shiny bike that I wanted. They taught me how to ride it. And then I lived on a very quiet street. I had the street to myself, and there were bumps in the street. So you could do wheelies and all kinds of
Oh
fun
yeah.
stuff. Uh, and then there was just playing in the backyard,
Yeah.
just we had a swing set back there. I mean, my mom also planted a garden. So I spent time helping her with the garden. And if I remember correctly, my parents remind me every now and then that I had an imaginary friend who was a horse named Fred. And I used to play with Fred in the backyard. So that's how I occupied my time. And
See, I feel like so much more connected to you. That's the beauty of the question because I also was a kid of the 70s. I was born right at the end of 69, like the bike riding, the freedom. And I had an imaginary friend who was a bear.
there you go.
So, who I think I just called Bear, to be honest.
Wow. Okay.
But yeah, so that's why I love that question because inevitably what happens if you do it with a team is like people say, I didn't know that about you. Or it's funny how sometimes you can see like what somebody loved to do as a kid is still so evident in how they show up at work. So it's a really fun question to kick off like a team staff meeting.
Oh man, I loved it. I always love bringing up childhood memories. So thank you for that question, because now I'm just smiling from the thought of what we used to have way back when, all those years
Yes.
ago. Thank you very much for appearing on the podcast. You can learn more about Janice's coaching and consulting work at fundraisingleadership.org. Janice, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. Have a good day.